Oh, for Fred, nerd and geek are not real things. Neither word describes any human condition, and the one is a straight up Seussian nonsense word. Literally a non-word made up by Dr. Seuss because he needed a rhyme. Nerd comes from the Dr. Seuss book from the early 1960s, describing one of the several fictional animals. The animal in question has no traits commonly associated with the nerd in the modern sense, and it's unclear where and when it shows up in nomenclature in current meaning. Likewise, geek originally referred to as carnival sideshow freakdacks, usually the seemingly normal performers who did grotesque and extreme stunts. So its transformation into a synonym for weirdo is easier to understand, but it wasn't conflated with nerd until recently. In fact, nerd and geek were firmly separate. Smart and awkward versus gross and strange, well into the 90s, not really becoming interchangeable until the mainstreaming of fandom culture, which both were associated with as a consumer market. Returning to nerd, the cultural idea that highly intelligent equaling socially inept itself is barely over 50 years old. Prior to the 1950s, if you saw a scientist or mathematician in fiction, they were either a mad villain, a square-jawed hero, or a kindly grandfather type. The nerd archetype, as we well know him now, awkward, good at science and math, socially stunted, emerges in fiction in the mid-60s and can actually be traced to a main source point, Jerry Lewis in the original 1963 Nutty Professor. This is really important. Whatever else you think of him, Lewis was one of those great observational comics of his era, and he excelled at picking up offbeat and hard-to-define traits of personality types and exaggerating them to the point where anyone could recognize the type despite a lack of usually ethnic/culture coding. You just knew they were the same specific type of weird you'd seen around IRL and laughed at recognition. Obviously, as we know more about the nuances of human psychology today, much of this is very dated. In Nutty, it's clear to 2018 eyes, the current year, that his character is a fairly unflattering caricature of what we now today a functioning neurotypical person. One whose atypically had seemingly helped him to establish a career in academic research science. It is unlikely Lewis knew that what he was doing, or that barely did. The autism spectrum was barely understood, and anyone who heard of the term likely associated exclusively with the unjustly institutionalized, not with their nutty science teachers. But everyone recognized the type Lewis was parodying, because guys like that have become much more visibly numerous post-WW2, and the face of popular science changed to centered laboratory and research fields via the space and nuclear scenes. In other words, even the positive stereotype of the nerd, geniuses with childlike decency but no social skills, becomes largely from a bit we would describe today likely see as a form of autism blackface. The third element to this fandom culture, which has its own issues. Fandom subcultures have been with us as long as fiction, but the concept has largely thought in terms of sci-fi/fantasy fandom, which goes back, at least in its convention fanzine hobby shop form at least, to the early 20th and goes mainstream with Star Trek cons in the 1970s. Prior to that, it's this self-aggrandizing idea that fans of weird fiction, pulp, and comics were misunderstood/put upon because they weren't simply different and better. The non-fans had already taken aggressive shape. They didn't call themselves nerds. They were slang. Slan was a 1940 serialized novel by A.E. Van Gogh, named for the race of super strong, super smart, evolved humans that centers on and how they face persecution from mundane, ordinary humans that fear their superiority. Yes, they did. Yes, everything you think ripped this off did. The idea that fans are slans takes off immediately in sci-fi and fantasy culture, and never goes away. It just gets gradually replaced by insert fandom geek, beginning around the 1970s or so, when weird, gross fanboy caricatures started showing up. Caricatures? Caricatures. In TV, movies, as a gag, likely the result of TV film pros encountering the slan behavior mostly for the first time in con/merch scene, becomes more important part of their promotional cycle. But where does the nerd come in? Well, that's complicated. Pre-70s, nerd/geek/fan weren't conflated. In fact, the common stereotype was nerd that was either elitist, out of date, or non-existent interest in pop culture. Think original 60s Peter Parker, who dressed like an accountant and only knew anime's old people music/movies. You live in your parents' basement, Bob. But, as fandom culture gains mainstream exposure, the idea that people who are into science fiction are often into/good at science proper comes with it. Trek's cash among space race crowd can be thanked for this, and also D&D's frequent cross-appeal to history buffs. So even though sci-fi/hard science from this encompasses maybe 25% of the genre, to outsiders the picture becomes fans equals geeks equals nerds equals smart, which has two huge after effects, both a bit silly and long-term not lovely. They capped these threads at 25, so I wrap this up as soon, being back an hour to finish, just FYI. No, you don't need to do that. No, not for our sake. So, pretty much all fan/geek pop properties get labeled as smart kid stuff in US culture. It takes a very high IQ to understand Bob Chipman. And that takes the old fans are slans thing and supercharges it. So if you're wondering why I'm oppressed because I'm big into these things that make me a superhuman intellect normally jealously hate, came from that. That's how we got here. To be continued.